Welcome back, everybody. This is B-Sides Las Vegas. This is the I Am The Cavalry track. Today's talk will be real-world security in a clinical healthcare environment, hacking a hospital. This is Paul Dant, and we're going to do a couple quick reminders. One, we are streaming on YouTube, so go ahead and if you do have any questions, go ahead and raise your hand. We'll get the microphone to you, okay? Two, please silence your cell phones. We really do need them to be silenced. If they're interrupting the talk, that will not be good, and security will not like it. You won't like it either. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors, especially our Inner Circle sponsors. That's Critical Stack and Valuemail. And our other sponsors, our stellar sponsors, those include lots of companies, from BlackBerry to Cylance to the NSA. And we wish to also thank all of our volunteers and everyone who comes together to help make this an incredible experience. So thank you. Without further ado, Paul, thank you.
Thank you. Hey everyone, thanks for coming into my talk, permitting you're actually in the talk you meant to be in. There's a lot of people here. I wasn't expecting that. But yeah, thanks for coming out. My name's Paul Dant. Not Drant, but it happens. So Paul Dant, I'm with a project called Coded Hills. We don't really know what this project does yet. Right now, we just speak at conferences. But what I'd like to talk to you guys about today is kind of some unique looks at, unique ways of looking at a few security topics that I happen to feel are pretty critical, and maybe we lose sight of some of these things because they seem too simple. Going from there to talk a little bit about IoT security, some of the common problems, examples of that. I've been researching for about 30 years in security, and I'm going to go into that in just a second, but really what I'm going to be presenting is sort of a culmination of a 2-year-long research project where we were, through both surveying and active testing, kind of assessing various aspects of hospital security. So not just med device, and by the way, this is not a med device security talk. You're probably all relieved of that, but we're going to talk about that a little bit, but it really is looking at a hospital facility as just overall a basic system and finding ways to exploit the system like we do with any other systems. So getting right into it, as far as an agenda, we're going to be kind of following along with these high-level topics. If you have questions, please feel free to raise your hand, as they said, and ask away. And if I'm going too fast, just let me know. As far as learning objectives, I'm not going to read through all of these. I imagine you guys will be able to download this slide deck some way through the event, so you can read through these. And I promise no more of these slides are wordy like this, but the learning objectives that I wanted to just kind of set out really pertain to the flow of the talk, so you guys can, of course, go back and review those later. So introducing myself, Paul Dant, I want to talk to you just a little bit about my journey in getting into this type of work, how I initially became interested. We all have stories like that. How I made a career, not necessarily on purpose, but just kind of things fell in place. And then a little bit about what I'm doing today. I wanted to establish some key kind of fundamental points as far as my belief system that are going to kind of pertain to the whole talk. And then I'm going to talk very quickly about some IoT hacking and security concepts. So I got started in security with video games. My first role was the volunteer ethical penetration hacker for my middle school. And you know, they appreciated my work, but what really got me interested in security was those that remember the shareware model when we were actually still distributing software on floppy disks. But you know, I could take these games that I wrote in BASIC to school and sell them for $5, and they have to pay me to get the little code and all that kind of stuff. So you know, it was really cool to get into that and have an opportunity at that age to start actually writing software and even trying to sell it. But I want to talk a little bit about that and how that led me into security. So just some sort of screenshots. It's difficult to get screenshots off of a Tandy 1000 monitor, but I started getting a bit paranoid about security with respect to software when one of the kids in school said, "Hey, my dad cracked your game and found your code. I want my money back." And kind of like, well, how did you do that? I kind of knew, but fell into it because of that. So I started building my idea of copy protection and warnings into software. And warnings like this: you will lose all files at your own cost. And then when we actually look at some of the code, I'm doing things like just plain text values. Obviously, this is tangential in a way to the overall concepts and concerns that we have today. But if you really think about the idea of distributed software, we got, in my view, a little bit spoiled with respect to security in the web age. As it's become more sophisticated, we've had unique challenges, but with mobile apps being a very, very large factor, we're now back to the model of distributed software and actually being able to look at code sort of like this and find ways to reverse software, get around security controls, and that sort of thing. So as I progressed through a career in security, if you guys haven't seen this before, I thought this was really funny, but I kind of went right down the middle here, as I think many of us probably have, and avoided the convict part. But it's led me to have the opportunity to do a lot of interesting assessment type engagements against places like nuclear facilities and film sets and school systems and banks, with a really unique focus on, not necessarily hacking a specific system, finding an exploit in a specific process or system, but rather holistically looking at things kind of in line with the ideas of threat modeling. And we're going to be getting into that in just a couple of minutes. And of course, the hospital security part that I mentioned is really where we're going to be focusing on as far as some of the latest projects that I've worked on and some of the interesting findings that stemmed from that. So I just wanted to throw a few key points out, primarily just, now that we're getting notices of breaches and compromise pretty much every week now, the media has shaped things in a very interesting way that lead a lot of people to think that hackers are magical in some way, and that maybe they sit down at a particular system and within 30 seconds, like on Swordfish, can crack into it. That doesn't really happen either. So we also have the idea that a lot of tools that we utilize today, threat modeling other processes for planning security strategy, those work for attackers too, in analyzing systems and finding weaknesses. Far-fetched is no longer relevant or acceptable is something that I've kind of grown up believing, because if you guys have had any experience with red team exercises as a teen, adults tend to not really want to believe that some of the things that you've identified can actually happen within their system. So the idea that there's no way someone would think of doing it that way, there's no way someone would find that, we can kind of just throw that out for the most part. And then any vulnerabilities that I might reference through this presentation, they were all disclosed responsibly, and we're not going to mention any vendors today. So one of the big things, and I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about security fundamentals with IoT, but if we want to just pick sort of a handful of problems that we tend to see with respect to IoT devices, as broad as that is, we see sort of a commonality in the way these things are typically vulnerable. Large and diverse attack surfaces, just take any IoT device that you might buy from Best Buy. There's probably Wi-Fi, BLE, maybe a camera. All of these things provide really interesting attack surfaces, not even necessarily just into those components, but maybe the rest of the system. We see constantly that default configurations tend to leave the running state of that device not secure, whether it's default passwords, no passwords, et cetera. There's always an assumption with these devices that the wireless or wired network that the device is operating on is itself secured. So there's really no reason to fortify the perimeters of our system because the environment around it is secure. We know that that's typically not true as well. Security design is something that I'm going to spend a little bit of time, so I'm just going to kind of bypass that, but it certainly does factor into the way a lot of devices, whether it's consumer devices or otherwise that have greater consequences with respect to security, we typically see that there's just not a lot of security thought in the design phases. And this is nothing new, of course, but the idea of bolt-on security especially doesn't work with devices that might be plugged into a patient or a car. And then lastly, binary protection is something that is almost always missing with respect to devices that allow us to actually pull software off of them and analyze them. So there's been some research, I don't know if you guys have seen any of it, it's kind of all over the place, but looking at a lot of mobile apps from just public app stores across various verticals like financial services, and just doing kind of the 5-minute static analysis type thing that you would do on an iOS or Android app. And we're seeing like 97, 98% of these apps have no attempt whatsoever at any sort of binary protection, despite the fact that they're readily available for analysis to really anyone that's interested. Did I lose it? Okay, so kind of bringing those same concepts back, I wanted to kind of frame the idea of what we're talking about when I speak to IoT devices. I'm sure everybody has ideas in their head of what we're speaking to, but in this very generic scenario, we have our kind of home automation type ecosystem. And when we put all of this into perspective, where we're looking at these things as independent systems as well as interconnected systems, and then apply these principles, that's pretty frightening. And again, that's nothing new as well, but we tend to, I think, as a whole, people who are trying to solve these problems sometimes get a little bit paralyzed by fear when looking at such wide and also deep problems and concerns with these products, devices, et cetera. You can couple that also, this diagram is supposed to represent a cloud or cotton balls. But the idea, of course, is that even outside of a residence or a business, all of these devices can also be connected to a whole bunch of other devices through the cloud or what have you. So that kind of just compounds the risk as we continue to see these same security vulnerabilities remain pervasive throughout these types of devices. And so I want to talk a little bit about the idea of designing security in. Not that it's difficult, but sitting down and designing a product, we all know that the primary focus is going to be on delivering functionality as soon as possible and iterative improvement and all of those types of things. But when we really take the time to sit down and think about what it means to design security into a system, we start to kind of understand more where some of these concepts like security and quality intersect and how these systems should be developed and thought about. This is probably pretty clear, but products are systems. So they kind of go together. I'll use them interchangeably, but the idea is that when we talk about products that are available to consumers, they don't come with any in-depth warning information, hey, you should change this default password. And that leads to a lot of challenges. We'll get into some more of those. But and then the last thing we're going to talk about here is kind of my idea of threat modeling, particularly when you want to use it against a system, kind of reversing the threat modeling idea, and how we can apply some of the simpler concepts to that process and maybe get value out of it. Whereas, and certainly not making any assumptions, but a lot of the organizations that I work with from a consulting perspective, tend to just not even know where to get started when it comes to threat modeling. When you have Microsoft's models and all these different nomenclatures, it becomes overwhelming. So I want to talk through a few principles that I've kind of adhered to that I think make that exercise a lot more straightforward. So before we jump into that, I made reference earlier to quality. And I know everybody is familiar with this, but it's always fun to just remind everyone how much issues cost to fix in production. We know that that's really where all of our cost is going in terms of fixing bugs that made it past a certain phase in the SDLC. So if we kind of think about that from a quality perspective, it kind of goes without saying that quality software can be secure software. Not necessarily, but the two definitely play they have a very cohesive relationship. I'm going to jump past that. And so when we talk about just step-by-step threat modeling, there's lots of examples. I just kind of pulled this one. There's plenty of variations and permutations of these steps, but the main ideas kind of remain. And those main ideas are the ones that I found typically get sort of lost in the rush when trying to plan and really develop solid security strategies that make sense for what we have and what we're hoping to build. So to talk through this really quickly, and I'm sure a lot of you guys are familiar with this, so I won't spend a lot of time, but there's a few key components to a threat model that is effective and actually works. Assets, guys know what we're referring to with respect to assets. Understanding where within the system those assets are going to sit. And obviously, we're speaking very generally here, and that's kind of the idea. We don't want to get too deep too quickly and miss the things that are pretty readily apparent, like I said, getting kind of lost in the details from the very start. We want to avoid that. So something else that when I work with organizations I find is a lot of times missing is good, updated documentation on the system. And that could mean everything, architectures for network, data flows, or even just how the software was built, what it does, why it does it certain ways. If we had that knowledge collectively, not in people's heads, but somewhere that it could actually be used, and we're achieving this, certainly. Things are getting better, but if we don't have that overall understanding, we really can't possibly think that we could effectively secure that system if we don't really know ourselves how it works. And it sounds very simple here, but when you sort of extrapolate that to, a multinational project where you have teams upon teams upon teams working on this stuff, we see a lot of that happening. The collective knowledge is strewn throughout different organizations, different document systems, learning systems, and all that stuff. And again, it gets lost. So not that I'm trying to preach to you guys, but just something that I've found along the way plays a very big role in understanding how to secure a system. And then decomposing the application or the system, classic problem solving where we're just decomposing the problem as much as we can, identifying components and the blocks of the system, how they work together. Threats, I don't want to really go do a big talk on threats and all the different ways that we interpret what a threat is or threat agents and this stuff, but it's definitely a part of the system. It's probably one of the more difficult elements of a threat model to really sit down and effectively brainstorm without going on kind of wild tangents. But what I've always found, and I'm going to get into this, I think, in the next slide, but when you decompose a system in order to develop the understanding that I'm kind of describing from an architecture perspective, some of the vulnerabilities or maybe places where an attacker would look to attack, threats in a sense, they kind of start bubbling up to the top as your understanding improves, as the overall architecture gets more in line accuracy-wise with what is actually out there, what attackers are actually looking at. So I found this, I can't take credit for this, but I thought this was a really good way to sort of bring all of these ideas together, culminating in something that I hadn't talked about yet. But so if we look at Bruce Wayne and Batman's threat model and the things that he's concerned about, Batcave and Alfred, these assets, of course, have different values to Batman. Maybe not all the same, but we also know that Batman has threats, the Joker, etc. So the part that I haven't really spoken to yet, and this is really fundamental to taking the output of a threat modeling exercise and applying it to your strategy, applying it to budgeting for security spend. But the protection, the controls and other security mechanisms that make sense for this system with respect to the assets and the threats that are targeting them. So very simple, but I think quite meaningful in terms of how all of these things fit together and how we could apply it to something a lot larger and of greater consequence. And before we do that, I wanted to talk about just some things that I've kind of taught as I work with organizations and teach classes, et cetera. But I've always found that classic video games taught me a lot of really interesting security lessons. Probably didn't realize it back then, but looking back, I think it's pretty cool. So I wanted to show you a few of those. But if you guys remember Shinobi, Mega Man, these are awesome games. So let's talk about Shinobi. If you're not familiar with Shinobi, you play the role of a ninja and you fight bad guys, and it's a platformer, and of course every level has a boss, and the boss is different in some way. So if we just kind of consider ourselves threat modeling this particular boss, we start to break things down from an architecture perspective. So loosely, what are the assets? Well, the asset is the guy's head that we're trying to shoot or hit. We can identify areas where attacks are ineffective. And of course, that's part of the whole idea of playing the game and winning. But if you really apply that to how you would typically look at, say, an architecture diagram, and you're starting to look for, we might refer to it as low-hanging fruit or obvious weaknesses, it's the same principles here. And I've always found that this can really help simplify understanding some of those ideas. Mega Man 2, I always thought was really cool. If you're not familiar with Mega Man, the whole idea is you get to pick a different robot to fight, and they all have different powers and abilities. And if you defeat the robot, you get that robot's weapons. And what makes the game interesting is that each boss has certain weaknesses to other weapons. And as the player, you have to kind of figure out how to do it. So if you think about, sitting there with Metasploit or really anything where you're trying to actually run an exploit and it's not working, Mega Man kind of follows the same idea that repetition is key. And it's also pretty relevant when we look at threat modeling as well. We didn't talk a lot about the threats within the threat model, but motivation is obviously always a factor when we're weighing risk of a particular system being attacked by a particular threat. And a lot of times that motivation is displayed in how willing you are to just keep trying harder and harder until you're actually able to exploit, successfully gain control, et cetera. And then lastly, this is definitely a stretch, but I just wanted to throw it in here. But detecting timing attack opportunities based on games like Punch-Out. So if you played Punch-Out, the whole thing is you're a boxer, and every guy that you box has a little timing tell. Some of them are very subtle, some of them aren't so subtle. Like I said, it's a stretch, but the really cool thing is it's sort of indicative of some of the things that we can do when we're testing for timing attacks, like the classic authentication timing attack. If I provide a valid username and the wrong password, how long does it take to return that? Versus if I provide an invalid username and a password. Obviously, if we start monitoring those various timings, we can start to see where things are, maybe where things are happening and where we might be able to inject fault. So yeah, I thought that was going to be a lot funnier than it actually was, but thank you for indulging me. So let's just come back to the threat modeling thing here and talk about how we would apply that to something real, and then we're going to talk about hacking a hospital. So if we look at just a generic system architecture, this is, I think, maybe the various systems involved with hotel guests checking in, the front desk people doing the cards, all that kind of thing, all the databases, all the web servers. And if we just kind of generically use this as our understanding of how the system works at a very rudimentary level, we can start to kind of focus in and build paths around, and this is further in the threat modeling concepts, but the idea of trust zones, trust boundaries, areas where we see communication between systems and there's effectively an inherent trust, at least the way the architecture is designed. When we start to understand those things, that's when we can actually start to, kind of like what we did in Shinobi, see potential weaknesses in the particular system, whether it's interfaces, network interfaces, physical interfaces, just areas that look interesting and most likely to yield something interesting. And of course, once we've done that exercise and maybe we take this concept, we run tests against the system to confirm what we think we found, and we're going to come up with a list of not necessarily vulnerabilities, but suspect vulnerabilities, potential vulnerabilities, and that's really how an exercise like this would be carried out. We'll start tackling each one of those potential ways to exploit the system. And then we typically end up feeling like this when someone breaks the system and we didn't think they were going to be able to. Okay, so getting to attacks in a clinical environment, in this case, we're speaking specifically of a hospital. We're going to talk just kind of about the exercise, how we planned it, our overall objectives, what we did to enumerate targets, et cetera, and then ultimately how we ended up winning. So if we start with primary objectives of the exercise, and again, this was done in concert with the facility. There was very limited staff knowledge, but in general, this was as real world as we could make it. And obviously, we weren't testing when it gets down to actual devices and systems. We weren't testing anything production or hooked to a patient. So the primary objectives of the exercise: disable the patient vitals monitoring mechanism in a specific patient room. So think about all of what that means. We have to identify the patient, we have to identify the room, we have to find some way to influence and disable the patient vital monitoring system. And you guys all know, I'm sure, what I'm describing, but all of the things connect to a patient in the bed. It goes to kind of like a hub, and then you have the displays in the nurse's station, you have the displays in the room, and all of those things, of course, are capable of alarming if any of those vital measurements change at a certain rate, go within out certain thresholds, et cetera. So there's that, and then we have to prevent re-enabling of that mechanism until notified. And what we kind of envision here with being notified is we are kind of playing out a hacker for hire scenario. So, we don't actually want to kill somebody in a hospital, but if someone wanted to pay us to disable some systems so they can kill them, well, that's kind of a different story. So we were kind of playing that scenario out. Ensuring no direct or indirect alarms go to staff members. Of course, we would have to understand rotations with nurses, doctors, that sort of thing. That's basically just a matter of sitting within the hospital and watching out. So all of those things can be aligned to make sure that whatever is actually happening once we disable the monitoring systems can actually take place in that room. So as we started surveying physically, looking for interesting ways that we could maybe get network access, make that network access persistent, maybe escalate, there were a few things that really stuck out. And of course, this scenario is really targeting a specific facility, but we found these sorts of things at all of the facilities we looked at. So going through some of the interesting ones. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say that we were able to do bad things on a hospital network from Starbucks. We were not. But what we did find is that the Starbucks in the hospital lobby offered free wireless internet access, and there were hospital production systems that were at least pingable from that wireless network. We let them know they weren't pingable anymore. We don't know what they were, but that's interesting. So yeah.
When you say hospital production, was that internal IP or is it just routable from the internet?
Internal IP, yeah.
The question? Repeat the question he asked, please.
Oh yeah, sorry. The question was that internal or IP route or internet routable? Yes. Yeah. So all internal systems, obviously there was some access control within the ingress for the wireless network into the Starbucks wireless network. So I don't think necessarily that could have been used. Anyway, I'm confusing myself, but yeah, they were internal systems. As I said, we didn't really work to identify them. We wanted to just let the staff know. But that was really interesting, and I think could be, had we not notified them and just played that out, that could have also led to some really interesting things. The patient and vendor kiosks that were placed throughout the hospital were also really important. There's interesting things with these kiosks and various attempts at kiosk mode and constraining the user interface, and it doesn't always work that well, especially now that things are touchscreen and you can just hold your finger down to get the context menu to pop up, and they never seem to anticipate that. But that's actually what we did on both patient and vendor kiosks. We used the vendor kiosks to basically go sort of back to past vendor check-ins, and we could print their badges out so that we had legit credentials to be walking around the hospital. The patient kiosks actually is where we established persistent network access, which was surprising. But it turned out just to be Windows systems running in kiosk mode, and they weren't too difficult to bypass. And that gave us a network access point. And what simplified it a lot for us is, I think, going through just kind of over high-level discussion, there were maybe like 274 VLANs throughout this hospital, and it was all completely wide open, completely flat. So a patient kiosk has as much access to everything as anything else does. And we let them know about that too, and that was something that they addressed pretty quickly. But nevertheless, now we have our persistent network access, and we were able to utilize the Windows, the Help Me thing, where you can let somebody remote access. And so we got remote access inbound into that patient kiosk. And that's really what let us start looking at some of the systems that we were more interested in to accomplish the primary objective without necessarily being stopped. So if you recall back in the primary objectives, we have to disable this particular device in a specific room for a specific patient. That obviously is going to require some trickery. We looked at social engineering aspects, but none of us knew enough about medical stuff to be able to talk to a doctor or a nurse and get them to give up the information. So on the flat network, we found all of these multifunction printing devices, faxes, et cetera. The same brand, essentially the same model used all throughout the hospital, including patient intake, surgical, et cetera. So this particular device actually had this really nice document cache where it would store anything that was faxed through it, inbound, outbound, and the default configuration didn't require a password for that document cache. So we actually found a treasure trove of PHI, just kind of wide open. But to our advantage, that's how we got the information for a specific patient. And now we didn't actually look at the PHI, of course. So we just made the assumption, okay, if the patient's in the hospital, we would be able to identify them and probably get the room number. So we've crossed that part off of the list as well. Now, the big part of the primary objective, disabling the monitoring system, this is where we needed the persistent network access so we could really start working on this particular system. And with all transparency, it was a production configured device, but not on a production network. Of course, it was put in place for us to be able to test. But aside from that, those were really the only exceptions made to make sure that we didn't actually hurt somebody. So this particular monitoring system was Linux-based, kind of what you would expect from IoT, the types of IoT devices you're going to see in hospitals. Lots of interesting physical input-output ports. Running Linux, hasn't been patched since 2009. So you guys remember the shell shock family of vulnerabilities. I mean, this was like vulnerable to all of them. So not hard to get root on this box. They have this lightweight web server, just a lot of the things that I'm speaking to that I think we all agree are pervasive. throughout a lot of the IoT, connected health, connected auto stuff that everybody's getting into. So through a variety of research, reverse engineering, getting around some interesting file integrity monitoring, like watchdog processes, we were able to tamper with the software and basically disabling it outright was difficult because it's always sending data to these other servers. So instead, we found a way to just take a cache of the data and replay it so that we kind of cut the input off. Kind of like if you want to rob a bank, you just loop the camera feed. We basically did that with the vitals. And so at that point, we actually had somebody connected to the monitor, the finger pulse, all that stuff. And we removed all the sensors, and it just kind of kept on going like everything was fine. So in theory, after that happens, we don't really know what is going to go on with the patient. An operative can be sent in, take the patient out, depending on the rotation of the nursing staff. That could go undetected for an hour and a half, hour, 45 minutes. So yeah, all of those things together allowed us to achieve that overall set of objectives, which we weren't too surprised about. We knew we would be able to do it, but we just didn't expect it to be quite that easy. And so, there was a lot of work with various vendors. The printer manufacturer that was involved sent some technicians in, disabled all those document caches. So there was a lot of good that came from the exercise, other than just, being able to tell really scary stories at conferences and shows. But can I get a time check, guys? Okay, cool. So with all of that said, now that we're kind of really thinking about what you could actually do in a truly coordinated, planned, funded attack against a healthcare facility, if we kind of go back to just the general idea of IoT devices, I wanted to talk about something that's kind of unique to them. But bore attacks, break once, run everywhere. I'm sure you guys are familiar with these. But those and other pervasive mistakes make hacking IoT really interesting, because any of the exploits that we might be able to carry out, say to find cryptographic keys, other secrets, what we see with a lot of these devices is that those cryptographic keys are the same on every single device. So if we've cracked one device, we've cracked all of them. Now, that's not the case with all IoT devices, of course, but quite a few of them. I mean, if you think about it from a manufacturing and just an overall production perspective, it can be challenging to automate that sort of thing so that there's an actual per device level of some sort of security. So as we kind of continued researching, if you guys are familiar with the IoT Hacking Village at DEF CON, I had been running it for the last couple of years, and that's really where we saw a lot of interest in bore attacks and kind of applying them to the other sorts of IoT devices that are available for consumers, like smart fridges and all those sorts of things. So with all that in mind, if you guys haven't heard of Shodan, it's a really interesting tool. It's not new. But you can kind of think of it as like a search engine for IoT devices. So if, let's say you wanted to look for Ricoh multifunction printers, in Shodan, what it's going to really provide is, based on whatever you're looking for in terms of keyword, pattern, et cetera, it's going to find devices and enumerate basically everything we need to know about them. So if I am, just looking at sort of a not so targeted attack, that's pretty easy, but I can also really dive in and start targeting specific organizations. So looking just for Ricoh, a brand of printer in the US, you can see, well, maybe you guys can't see that, but so Telnet is the top service identified for all of these devices. The top organizations are AT&T and Cogent, Level 3, Comcast Business. And so basically these are just printers that are sitting on a network that somehow is allowing access from the outside world, with really, really vulnerable services still running. Like Telnet, FTP is one that we see quite a bit. Sorry about that. So this particular device, it enumerates the ports, and then we can see pretty instantly how we can exploit these vulnerabilities and get into the system. And to make it even easier, Shodan has an exploit database so that you can actually search for specific types of devices, specific vendors, find those exploits, and then go back to your listing and just start hacking them. So what we have found to be really interesting in doing workshops and stuff with various IoT device manufacturers, everything from like lighting companies, like enterprise office lighting. Those systems are really complex. I hadn't seen them before, and it's really interesting. But as part of just a security workshop with them, we encourage them to start looking for things related to their lighting devices using Shodan. And right there live in the workshop, we start looking. It's like, oh yeah, we know that customer. So we click on the device, and there's the port that's used to basically log into these devices. And we tried the default password, and we got in. Like, shouldn't have been, but it was eye-opening for that organization. And it goes to something I had mentioned previously, especially on the consumer side of IoT, when consumers that are unaware of this stuff continue to be unaware and use these devices, our exposure just kind of continues to compound. And that, I think, is why organizations tend to not look at tools like Shodan. Maybe they don't really want to see what is actually happening. I think that's always valid. But it's overwhelming, and it brings to mind who's really responsible. Is the lighting system manufacturer responsible for notifying their users of all of these different types of risks inherent in using their devices? Is it the consumer or the buyer's responsibility to understand what those risks are? We don't really know. We can put warnings on packs of cigarettes about the risks there, but when we're actually talking about potentially exposing sensitive information to anyone, there's really not a lot of awareness on the part of vendors, et cetera. So kind of in summary, where I'm going with that is tools that can show us just how pervasive those types of systems are become really useful for attackers, of course, but also for us. So yeah, if you have some time, definitely check that out. If you work for an IoT device manufacturer, really check it out and see if there's anything interesting that could be maybe exposing your organization. Okay, so we're wrapping up. I'm not going to read these either, very much like the learning objectives at the beginning. But what I really wanted to just close with is the idea, and I know that you've heard this before, it's somewhat cliche, but when we approach security planning, developing strategies, exercises like threat modeling, I mentioned before that there's a lot of opportunity for paralysis by analysis, becoming overwhelmed. I think we, in general, as an industry, have started to really feel the weight of that. And whether it's just renewed looks at some of these issues, new paradigms that maybe we're trying to move into, we just have to continue to combat what is typically happening in organizations where we just allow security planning to become a bureaucratic process that really doesn't produce anything. We can get around that. And my personal belief, of course, with everything that I've described today is that looking at these things in a much simpler way than we tend to today can really yield a lot in terms of how to proceed forward and actually start securing things based on the value of the assets, based on what is likely to attack those assets. So spending intelligently is ultimately what we're really talking about. So that's all I have. Thank you guys very much for your time. Sorry about the video game thing. I really thought that was going to play well. Thanks, guys.
And we have time for questions.
Oh yeah, I always forget that.
If you have any questions, go ahead and raise your hand. We'll pass the mic to you.
I did like the video game thing.
Questions, not statements.
On your slides, it looked like you had some kind of physical reconnaissance, perhaps, to get your maps or to get the physical locations of things in your maps. I'm not sure. Can you talk about that?
Sure. Yeah, that map actually came from Google, just as a hypothetical. Because at the end of the day, these facilities are all laid out the same. Did I? Yeah, that was all physical reconnaissance for sure. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about how you did the persistence on the kiosks?
Yes. So once we were able to basically, the patient kiosks were Windows systems. So once we were able to get admin on that, we just utilized, and the name of the actual service is evading me, but it's Microsoft's built-in Windows tool for remote support, for actually allowing someone to access, inbound. And, all we did was just tunnel the traffic over something that could actually go out and come back in. And we had pervasive network access.
Question about the, I know you had a primary objective of trying to disable a specific target, but were you able to get a hold of or have access to the electronic medical record?
That's a good question. Just given the objectives of the exercise, we weren't too concerned about that. We did find that, like a lot of systems that are storing records that people need to access, there's extraneous ways to access that data. So lightweight web servers, of course. So I think the answer is yes. We felt that those systems are likely exposed as much as some of the other systems that we involved in the attack. But we didn't actually look for that specifically. But given it was all right there on the printers, it's reasonable to assume that, yeah.
Did you say how long did it take you to get all that access?
Probably about a year. Yeah, and that's not so much because of, us taking a year to figure it out. Just some of the planning and continuous approvals needed to keep moving with the exercise. But
do you have a clean version of the report that can be published or is being published?
Yeah, there is actually one that is published. I'll get with you after.
In the medical space, one of the reasons that we hear that it's so vulnerable is that systems can't be patched. You have to have FDA approval, on and on and on. And I'm wondering about what you're finding that facilities are doing for mitigation. Are they going to micro VLANs, or are they completely isolating systems so that they're not internet accessible? Or can you speak to that at all?
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question, and a lot of it. Yes, they're trying these things, but when you haven't even figured out access control for the basics of your LAN. They're falling behind. And so we see the normal constraints in budget and staffing, and that's what's preventing these facilities from moving forward with strategies like that. What I'll also say, though, that makes these things challenging, these devices, especially when they're not being updated properly, is that from a network access perspective, you can try isolating it all you want, but they have physical access ports, including an Ethernet port. So, all you really need to do is literally find out the right color bracelet for that day, and you've got the whole hospital you just walk around. Find an empty patient room, and, if you're willing to run the risk, maybe spend 20 minutes plugging into it, and yeah. So that's a big challenge too, is physical access.
Just to clarify on the comment of the previous person that was asking, medical devices, there's a myth that medical devices cannot be updated per that. The FDA has changed that. It is now a requirement of both the vendor and the hospital to update those medical devices. I wanted to make sure that was clarified and on the video before I asked my question.
Nice.
My question is that this medical device, do you know if it was recalled or not? Because there are a lot of medical devices that have been recalled but are still in use in hospitals. And you mentioned that the firmware was in 2007, I believe. And usually,
2009, it was Gen 2 Linux. Yeah.
okay. And usually it takes about 5 years for a medical device to go from production. And usually that means that it was frozen for 5 years, at which point it should be updated. So tell me that device probably came out 2013 and has been out for about 5 years or so. So I'm just curious if you had a chance to check to see if it had been recalled or not, or if there are any types of FDA notices on it.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not aware of a recall. We certainly had some conversations with the vendor. They were actually aware of most of the vulnerabilities that we identified in the exercise already. And yes, so to your point, the challenge with keeping these devices updated, it's a challenge just in terms of the work that's involved, the access that's required, the organization that's in place to properly distribute updates. Yeah.
That again for a comment. To build on this, the post-market surveillance from FDA stands for the purple area here today. I don't try to remember at the moment, but also Seth Carney, he's also here. The post-market basically says if you have a vulnerability, obviously we want to tell the vendors, but for their sake, if there's an unmitigated pathway to harm, they'll do a safety communication. So a lot of times, vendor wants to handle it themselves, and they usually encourage you start there. But the process is supposed to work that when you kind of find something with an unmitigated pathway to harm, something should happen.
Agreed, especially if they were already aware of it. Yeah. And the Suzanne has seen a variation of this talk. Yeah, we've.
Awesome. It looks like we have one final question here.
This is a little bit of a basic question, but if we were to look at the IoT devices and in barring the physical access to the Ethernet port question, if we were to say that all the IoT devices in question, their only communication was a call out to a well-known address, how much harder would your task have been? So in other words, they would not accept any inbound connections at all. It's only outbound that they initiated.
Well, so assuming that the functionality isn't impacted by that constraint, yeah, it probably would have made it more challenging. That the main thing is, if we're not getting physical network access, we could otherwise get physical access to the storage in some way. So when the software is actually making calls out to known addresses, et cetera, that really just becomes a matter of analyzing the software and tampering with it, to change the call out, to change the list of known addresses, that sort of thing. So that would be the approach there. It makes it more difficult, but as long as we can get access to the binaries that are running on that device, we can bypass most. In my experience, I don't know why I keep saying we and our, but in my experience, most of those controls can be bypassed.
Thank you very much, Paul.
Thanks, guys.